Hello, everyone. It is Dr. Lambert here. So, tonight I'll be speaking about the COVID-19 vaccine. Are we trading apparent freedom from the virus for long term chronic disease? I just have a couple of disclaimers I want to make. So, number one, I am a medical doctor. However, I do not currently practice medicine, so the information that's provided in this video should not be used for medical advice. Please speak with your healthcare provider about that. Secondly, I am not here to put down medical professionals or, individuals who have taken the vaccine because, the purpose of this video is to simply be informational. However, there are some very important points about the vaccine that have not been mentioned, or I should say that haven't been thoroughly discussed in the mainstream media, and that's what I'm here to talk about in this video. So I'll be discussing four main topics. First, I'll be talking about exactly what is a clinical trial. A lot of people don't exactly know what a clinical trial actually entails. I'll be discussing that as it relates to the main studies for Pfizer and Moderna, those two clinical trials. Afterwards, I will then be speaking about what exactly is an emergency use authorization as it relates to the COVID-19 vaccines. I will then speak about some of the main issues related to the current Moderna and Pfizer vaccine clinical trials. And also, I'll be talking about the potential for long-term chronic disease, most notably autoimmune disease. Now, I want to point out that I am doing a live for both Facebook and also Instagram. So if I'm not exactly looking directly into the camera, don't be alarmed. Also, to all the information that I'll be providing in this video has been thoroughly researched. And so I will be linking the resources below my video on Facebook as well as my YouTube channel. I probably won't be able to do it for Instagram because, well, for one, it'd be kind of hard to do. But anyway, let's get started. So I first want to talk about what exactly is a clinical trial. So a clinical trial is basically a research study in which, scientists or even physicians are looking at how effective a drug or vaccine is in treating or preventing a disease. So clinical trials are composed of three main phases: phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. So with phase 1, it can last a few months and include, say, 10 to about 80 participants. The main goal of phase 1 is to find the best dose of the drug at which there are the least side effects or adverse events. Phase 2 actually would include several hundred participants and also looks at how efficacious that drug or vaccine is at preventing or treating illness in a research or experimental setting. It also continues to look at the safety and efficacy of the drug or vaccine. Now, phase 2 can last 1 to 2 years. Now, phase 3 is the next phase of the clinical trial, and that can last 1 to 4 years. It includes thousands of participants, and researchers continue to look at the safety and efficacy of the drug or vaccine. Now, it's very important that we keep in mind that before a drug or vaccine can receive FDA approval, it has to essentially pass through each phase, typically in order, and ultimately takes about 15 years for that entire process to be completed. Now, that actually creates some issues as it relates to the current vaccine clinical trials because they happen so quickly within 1 year. And if you take a look at the clinical trials for Moderna and Pfizer, we see that they are essentially carrying out phases 1, 2, and 3 essentially simultaneously. Now, that data you can actually find at clinicaltrials.gov. For example, with the Moderna clinical trial specifically, their phase 1 actually started in March of 2020 and is expected to end in November of this year. For the phase 2 portion of the Moderna clinical trial, it started in May 2020 and is expected to end August of 2021. And phase 3 started in July of 2020, is expected to end in October of 2022. But as you're hearing me say, there's quite a number of overlap between phases 1, 2, and 3 for the Moderna clinical trials. And a similar thing can also be seen with Pfizer, because their clinical trial combines phases 1, 2, and 3, and it actually started in April of 2020 and is expected to end in January of 2023. So these clinical trials are very rapidly done, and also too certainly because they are still currently working on phase 1, it kind of causes one to question, did they adequately test the safety of these vaccines? And the truth is, the answer is actually no. And if you take a look at the clinical trials themselves, you would actually read that they were really only able to assess for short-term adverse events, more direct adverse events from the actual injection site, including pain, redness, and swelling, and even some systemic symptoms, including headache, fever, and chills. This brings me to my next important point, which is the emergency use authorization that these vaccines received as a preventative measure for the COVID-19 disease. And some people are actually, wondering exactly what is an emergency use authorization. And if you actually go to the FDA website, it states that under Section 564 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the FDA can actually allow for unapproved medical products or even unapproved uses of a medical product to be used in an emergency to diagnose, treat, or prevent serious or life-threatening diseases or conditions caused by, in this case, SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID-19. So ultimately, they're able to do this in this current case that they don't have any adequate, approved, or available alternatives. So if they don't have any adequate, available or approved alternatives, then ultimately the EUA approval for this vaccine is simply telling us that this vaccine may or may not actually work in preventing the COVID-19 disease. So that brings me to my next point, in which some of you may be wondering. So if you or your loved ones are injured by any of these vaccines, would the FDA or the U.S. government or even any of the vaccine companies be held liable? And according to the Office of the Federal Register of the National Archives and Records Administration, basically the short answer is no. What they basically tell us on their website is that vaccine companies and the government are actually given liability immunity for activities related to medical countermeasures against COVID-19. So basically at this point, with the EUA authority given by the FDA with these current vaccines, they are still not FDA approved, and ultimately they're just being used for emergency use. So they're still ultimately experimental. Okay. So now the next topic I want to cover is just briefly go over the main study results of the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine clinical trials. So the first thing with the Moderna clinical trial, many of you probably already know that the main study result was that they had a 94.1% efficacy for preventing symptomatic disease due to COVID-19. And that essentially does sound like pretty good news, right? I mean, of course, if you can get a shot and it could prevent 94% of the COVID-19 disease, that might sound pretty like something that could possibly be beneficial. However, there are some drawbacks for the Moderna clinical trial that really need to be emphasized. And number one, they were not really able to fully assess for any long-term side effects. It was mostly just immediate side effects at the injection site, including pain, redness, and swelling, right? But they weren't able to determine what the long-term side effects are. So they're going to continue to monitor participants for the next 2 to 3 years. So it's going to be quite a number of time. It might even take up to 10 years for them to really fully assess the long-term side effects of the Moderna vaccine. Another thing to keep in mind is that participants were also asked to continue to wear masks and socially distance. So they weren't even able to determine whether or not we could stop wearing masks or socially distance if we got this vaccine. And they also weren't even able to assess for asymptomatic transmission. So they don't even know the vaccine can prevent that either. And that was also a major concern during this pandemic. A similar situation can also be seen with the Pfizer vaccine. So they actually had a 95% efficacy or effectiveness at preventing the development of symptoms from COVID-19. But again, individuals were still asked to mask and social distance. So you don't know if you can stop wearing a mask or stop social distancing after taking this vaccine. Additionally, they were not able to follow participants. Well, they're still following participants for long-term adverse events, so they don't know what those will be just yet. And finally, they were not able to assess for asymptomatic transmission. So those are major issues and definitely ones that we need to consider, especially if someone is considering taking any of these experimental vaccines. Now, other issues I want to mention with the Pfizer and Moderna clinical trials is how they diagnosed COVID-19 in the participants that actually developed the disease. And they only really had two main criteria. Participants had to have at least 2 COVID-19 symptoms, and they had to have a positive PCR test. Now, if you take a look at the symptoms of COVID-19 disease and that of, say, for example, the flu virus, they overlap quite considerably. They include cough or runny nose, fever, loss of sense of smell or taste. And even though loss of sense of smell or taste with COVID has some uniqueness to it, it could still be rather subjective. It depends on the individual for sure and what they're telling you. Their studies did not say whether or not they ruled out the flu or even tested for it. So how do we really know? And all a participant needed to have to be diagnosed as part of the diagnosis for COVID-19 was just 2 symptoms. The second thing to keep in mind was the PCR test that they used to diagnose COVID-19 in these clinical trials. Now, PCR, you probably may know, is a molecular biology tool that's used to amplify the genetic material of the virus, in this case SARS-CoV-2, to a detectable amount. In an article that was written in the New York Times, was actually republished in January of this year, they actually stated, and it has been said in other news articles as well, that the cycle threshold for the PCR test that was used by most laboratories throughout this pandemic was actually too high. So it was around about 40. So a cycle threshold is basically just the number of cycles that the PCR machine would have to undergo in order to produce a detectable amount of virus. But in the case of this current pandemic, they use CT cycle thresholds or CT values that were just way too high. So essentially 40 plus, which means that you could just be amplifying viral debris that's not even infectious. And so as a result, it could have been that we had more cases than we really should have had, and maybe the cases were actually a lot lower. In the case of these clinical trials, they didn't even mention the cycle threshold that they used, which to me is concerning. At least it could have put it in the methods section. Also, too, in the article in the New York Times that I just mentioned, it was actually stated by the CDC that cycle thresholds of 33 or greater might not even produce, any virus that could actually be cultivated. And also in an article that was written in Eurosurveillance and earlier in 2020, which I'll also link in my references on my YouTube channel and also my Facebook page, they actually were able to document that the best cycle threshold should have been somewhere between 15 and 20, which technically wasn't really used throughout in most laboratories during the pandemic. So ultimately, there's quite a number of questions that we really should be asking as it relates to these vaccines and also to how COVID-19 was even diagnosed and even tested for in these 2 studies and just in general. So that brings me to my next important topic, which is really important for many people, and many people are wondering, what are the long-term side effects or adverse effects of these vaccines? Well, of course, currently right now, we don't really know 100%, but there was a recent article that was written by a laboratory group called Bajdouni et al. It was published in January of this year in a journal article called Frontier. They are actually concerned about the potential for autoimmune disease as it relates to the COVID-19 vaccine. So what they described was that the antibodies that our immune system produces against the virus that causes COVID-19 could possibly bind to or cross-react with proteins in our own tissues. And part of the reason for this is because the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus actually exhibits some similarities to some of the proteins in your own body. So what they found, and they actually did this study actually in a laboratory test tube setting, so it wasn't done in humans, but they did use antibodies or monoclonal antibodies that are very similar to the ones that we produce. And what they found was that those monoclonal antibodies against the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein actually cross-reacted with 28 of 55 human tissue proteins, which included tissue transglutaminase, which is involved in celiac disease, tissue peroxidase, which is involved in thyroid disease or autoimmune disease of the thyroid, pardon me, and also a mitochondrial protein called M2, which is involved in 90 to 95% of an autoimmune disease of the liver called primary biliary cirrhosis. So essentially, there is a possibility for the development of autoimmune disease in individuals who take these experimental vaccines. Of course, it will take a long time to develop an autoimmune disease, but it's still very important because nobody wants to live with a chronic disease, as they are debilitating and very, costly to treat and manage. So that's just an example of one possible long-term adverse effect or side effect of these vaccines. But let's not forget about some of these short-term adverse events that have happened in the media that essentially were kind of swept under the rug because they were related to these vaccines. For example, in Norway, 23 elderly patients actually died shortly after taking the COVID-19 vaccine. This was actually very devastating because the whole goal of promoting, getting everyone vaccinated was to protect our most vulnerable, the elderly. Many elderly individuals in long-term care facilities don't typically get adequate care. They tend to get the worst food, essentially canned food that's high in salt. Many of them actually suffer from loneliness and depression, and they also live in unsanitary conditions. And those things were never mentioned or even emphasized in the media as to how they would even deal with those issues, which certainly can result in a depressed immune system. Another thing to consider too is the case of a 70-year-old man who actually died within a half hour after receiving his COVID-19 vaccine at the Javits Center in New York City, as well as a 56-year-old Florida OB-GYN who actually died from a hemorrhagic stroke after receiving his COVID vaccine on December 18th. And there's one case I want to mention that maybe some of you have heard of. It was kind of like a viral video of a woman by the name of Sean Skelton who developed full body convulsions and tongue fasciculations shortly after taking her COVID vaccine. So these cases are definitely real and they did occur. However, there wasn't any thorough investigation done as to whether or not their cases were actually linked to the vaccine that they recently took. Instead, it was either their cases were either ignored or they attributed their deaths or case to something else. So we need to genuinely consider the fact that these vaccines, given that they are new and experimental, Not only do they need further testing, but at the same time, we need to keep in mind that they can potentially cause long-term and serious side effects. Now, I know some of you probably might be wondering, okay, Dr. Lambert, you mentioned a lot of not so positive sides of the vaccines, but is there anything that people can do to actually boost their immune system or protect themselves from COVID-19? Well, I have to be honest with you, I do believe that God did give us the answer for this pandemic. And first of all, it did come in taking appropriate diet and lifestyle measures. But if that wasn't even enough, we also heard about drugs, medications that could have been used. For example, hydroxychloroquine or even ivermectin. Now, those two drugs got a lot of bad press in the media. And honestly, the reasons that we got weren't necessarily the best reasons. And I want to start first with hydroxychloroquine. So, one of the main issues with hydroxychloroquine was that it was actually potentially lethal in individuals who actually took it. But what we need to keep in mind is that hydroxychloroquine was tested actually in large clinical trials, including the Solidarity, the Discovery, the Remap, and the Recovery clinical trials. And what they did was they actually gave participants large lethal doses of hydroxychloroquine. They actually resulted in lethal heart arrhythmias. But it wasn't because hydroxychloroquine wasn't necessarily a reasonable drug to use in the treatment or in this fight against COVID-19, but it was because they gave them lethal amounts. Any drug can be used as a poison, essentially. So you need a trained physician to give an appropriate amount for that particular condition. The issue with hydroxychloroquine is that patients should have been given a low dose amount of hydroxychloroquine. There was one study that was done by Dewand et al. In 2020, and what they found was that when low dose hydroxychloroquine was coupled with an antibiotic like azithromycin and zinc, it was actually more effective at reducing the number of hospitalizations of patients with COVID-19 and even deaths among those patients. So that's really what it should have been. Another thing too to keep in mind with that is that zinc is really important too in this fight against COVID-19. Did you know that patients with heart disease actually have low zinc levels? Part of the reason for this is because many of the antihypertensives that they take actually deplete their zinc. And that wasn't spoken much about in the media either. So it's really important that all these factors are considered in this fight against COVID-19. Like the vaccine is not the silver bullet to this. It's really diet and lifestyle. The next thing I want to talk about too is ivermectin. That was another drug that was spoken about and also ignored by the mainstream media as well. And there was a physician by the name of Dr. Kory who spoke about it. And his article, written by the Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance, and what they found, it was actually a review article, was that ivermectin could potentially prevent transmission of the virus that causes COVID-19 among human subjects. Part of the reason for this is because ivermectin actually prevents the virus from replicating inside the cells and also helps to reduce inflammation. Another thing too is that it also reduces the viral load, and the viral load in the well, in particular, they found this in animal studies. It helps to reduce the viral load and also could potentially protect against organ damage. Now, I kind of want to wrap this entire video up by simply saying that COVID-19 disease is actually a self-limiting disease, and I'm not the only person that's saying that. It's actually on the World Health Organization website. They say that themselves, that COVID-19 disease is self-limiting. Now, of course, we are concerned about our most vulnerable groups, individuals who have heart disease, obesity, diabetes, and the elderly. But it's so important that we remember that, especially with the chronic diseases, they are potentially reversible with diet and lifestyle, right? For sure. A plant-based diet, getting proper supplementation with zinc, vitamin D, and even vitamin C. And also, too, even with our elderly, we have to consider the fact that they actually don't, especially those in long-term care facilities, they don't actually get the best treatment. So ultimately, I do believe that God has given us the answer for this. And first, it started with diet and lifestyle. If that wasn't enough, definitely we did have repurposed drugs, although they weren't exactly repurposed, but by the FDA. But they did include hydroxychloroquine and zinc. Now, at this point, my hope is that you know my hope is that people will actually start to do their own research and actually begin to study how the immune system works, how their bodies work, but most importantly, look to Christ and look to God and ask him for wisdom and guidance as to how to take care of your bodies. It is his will that we all have an understanding of this. Yes, you need a good doctor on board. There's a reason we have doctors, right? However, at the same time, your health is your responsibility. I've spoken to many people on the streets about this topic, and some people might say, "Oh, well, it's too hard for me to change my diet. It's too hard for me to get into an exercise routine." But what I did discover during this entire pandemic was that they use a lot of propaganda to recondition our minds to take this vaccine. Why couldn't they have used that same aggressiveness essentially, or essentially use advertisements to encourage people to eat healthier, to exercise, to take care of their mental health, and even talk about issues related to low zinc in patients that have heart disease, who are taking heart disease medication, or medications for heart disease, such as diuretics, or even hydrochlorothiazides. So those are things that we need to see more of, and honestly, as a people, we really need to fight for. Otherwise, we're not going to have it. So I just want to finish off this video, and I want to say that again, I'm not here to put anyone down that has taken a vaccine, or any physicians for that matter. As I went through medical school, and I understand what needs to be done. However, I do believe that we all have a choice in whether or not we choose to take this vaccine. And it's so important that we pay attention to all of the events that are going on surrounding it, because there is the issue of vaccine passports, kind of giving the impression that people may have to have this vaccine in order to travel. So it's so important that we pay attention to what's going on and fight for our rights to have the information that we need so that we can make the decisions that are best for us as individuals. And also to make sure that, and also to fight for good, healthy nutrition. That's really important. So that's pretty much I want to leave with you all today. And I will leave the links to all of my sources below the title of my video. It was a pretty loaded video, but it is really an important topic that needs to be continually discussed. And I'm not the first person to say any of the things that I said. There are many doctors who have spoken about this. And I just pray that you all are, blessed and encouraged. And just remember, Hosea 4 verse 6 says, "My people perish for lack of knowledge because they have rejected it." What that simply means is this, the knowledge is there, but we have to really be willing to read it for ourselves and ask God for wisdom. He does want you to be in good health. All right, guys, have a good night, and I hope you have an amazing weekend, and you enjoy the resurrection weekend with your families. Take care of yourselves, and God bless.